America was a new country. It had just won its independence, but it had a big problem. It didn't have a home. Not a real one, anyway. The government had to keep moving around. It was like a guest, never settling down. This moving around caused lots of headaches. It made the government look weak. It made it hard to get things done. After the Revolutionary War, the United States was a loose bunch of states. They were like brothers who agreed to live in the same house, but argued about everything. The Articles of Confederation were the first attempt at a government, but they gave the central government very little power. It couldn't even tax people directly. It had to ask the states for money, and the states often said no. So, the government bounced from city to city. It met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Then it went to Princeton, New Jersey, then Annapolis, Maryland, then Trenton, New Jersey, and then New York City. Each city wanted the government to stay. It meant money and power. But none of these places really worked out. They were state capitals first, they weren't neutral ground. The idea of a federal capital, a place that belonged only to the nation, started to grow. People saw it as a way to unite the states. It would be a symbol of their new country. But choosing that spot was a huge fight. Every state, every region wanted it. It was like everyone wanted the biggest slice of pie. One big event showed how weak the government was. It happened in 1783 in Philadelphia. A group of unpaid soldiers, veterans of the Revolutionary War, got angry. They marched on Congress. They demanded their pay. Congress was meeting in the State House, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. The soldiers were loud. They were threatening. Congress asked the Pennsylvania state government for help. They wanted the state militia to protect them. But the state governor was slow. He didn't want to use force against local soldiers. He said he couldn't get the militia together fast enough. This made Congress very nervous. They felt unsafe. They felt like the state wasn't protecting them. So Congress packed up and left Philadelphia in a hurry. They moved to Princeton, New Jersey. This event, known as the Pennsylvania Mutiny, was a big wake-up call. It showed that the federal government needed its own space. It needed its own security. It couldn't rely on a state for protection. It needed a place where it was clearly in charge. A place where the federal government was supreme. Another event, Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, also showed the problem. Farmers, many of them war veterans, were losing their land. They couldn't pay their debts and taxes. They rebelled against the state government. The federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, couldn't do much. It had no army to send. It had to rely on the state to put down the rebellion. This was another sign that the national government was too weak. It needed to be stronger. It needed a proper home. These problems led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The delegates decided they needed a stronger federal government. They wrote a new constitution. This new constitution included a plan for a district not exceeding 10 miles square. This district would be the permanent seat of the government. It would be carved out of existing states. It would not be part of any state. It would belong only to the federal government. This was a big step. It meant the government would finally have its own place. It would be safe. It would be respected. But the Constitution didn't say where this district would be. That was left for Congress to decide, and that decision sparked a fierce battle. A battle that almost put the capital in a completely different city. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a reason why their spot was best. It was a fight for power. It was a fight for money. And it was a fight for the future of the country. The location of the capital was not just about bricks and mortar. It was about shaping America itself. It was about balancing North and South. It was about showing the world that this new country was here to stay, and that it had a home. Many cities wanted the capital. It meant money. It meant prestige. It meant jobs. Philadelphia was a strong contender. It was the largest city in the country then. It had been a center of the revolution. It had good infrastructure. Many thought it was the natural choice. New York City also wanted it. It was a major port. It was growing fast. Other cities like Baltimore and Maryland and Trenton and New Jersey also put their names forward. But it wasn't just cities. People looked at specific spots along major rivers. The Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania was a popular idea. And the Potomac River, further south, also came up a lot. The choice of a capital was not just about finding a nice piece of land. It was deeply political. The country was divided. The northern states were more about trade and manufacturing. They had big cities. The southern states were more about farming, especially cotton and tobacco. They had large plantations and relied on enslaved labor. These two regions had different interests. They mistrusted each other. Having the capital in one region would give that region more influence. Southern states worried that a capital in the north would mean northern interests would always win. Northern states worried the same about a southern capital, so the location became a key bargaining chip. It was like a game of chess. Everyone wanted to move their pieces into the best spot. At the heart of this struggle was a major financial problem. Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, had a bold plan. He wanted the federal government to take over or assume the debts of the individual states. During the war, states had borrowed a lot of money. Hamilton believed that if the federal government paid these debts, it would strengthen the national credit. It would show the world that America was trustworthy. It would tie the states more closely to the federal government. But many people didn't like Hamilton's plan, especially states in the South, like Virginia. They had already paid off a good chunk of their debts. They didn't want to help states like Massachusetts, which still had huge debts. They saw it as unfair. They thought it would give too much power to the federal government, and they feared it would enrich northern speculators who had bought up state debt at low prices. Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, and James Madison, a key leader in Congress, were strong opponents of Hamilton's plan. They were Virginians. They represented Southern interests. The fight over assumption was fierce. It threatened to tear the young country apart. The votes in Congress were very close. Hamilton's plan looked like it would fail. If it failed, the new federal government might not get off the ground. It could cripple the nation's finances. This is where the famous dinner table bargain comes in. It happened in June 1790. Hamilton was desperate. He reached out to Jefferson. Jefferson later recounted how Hamilton approached him looking somber and distressed. Hamilton explained the crisis. He said the government's credit was at stake. He needed Southern votes for his assumption plan. Jefferson, knowing Madison's influence in Congress, arranged a dinner. It was held at Jefferson's temporary residence in New York City. Present were Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison. They were political rivals, but they were also patriots. They knew the country needed to move forward. At this dinner, they struck a deal. It was a classic political compromise. Jefferson and Madison agreed to rally Southern votes for Hamilton's plan to assume state debts. In return, Hamilton agreed to use his influence to ensure the new permanent capital would be located in the South. Specifically, it would be along the Potomac River. This was a huge turning point. It settled two massive issues at once. It put the nation's finances on solid ground, and it decided the location of the capital. It showed that even rivals could work together for the good of the country. But it also showed how much power the capital's location held. It was important enough to trade for something as vital as the nation's financial stability. Without this deal, the capital might have ended up in Philadelphia, or New York, or somewhere else entirely. The Potomac was chosen not just because it was a good spot, but because it was the price of unity. The choice of the Potomac River for the new capital was not an accident. It had a very powerful advocate, George Washington. No, he wasn't just the first president, he was also a wealthy landowner and a visionary. His home, Mount Vernon, was right on the Potomac. He knew the river well, he believed in its potential. Washington saw the Potomac as more than just a river. He saw it as a gateway. It could connect the northern and southern states. It could also provide a link to the American West through canals and waterways. He thought a capital on the Potomac would help bind the young country together. It would encourage trade and development. It would be a symbol of unity. The Compromise of 1790 set the general area, the Potomac. But it didn't pick the exact spot. That was left to President Washington. He was given the power to choose the 10-mile square district. Washington personally surveyed sites along the river. He knew the land. He rode through the areas. As he looked at different properties, finally, he picked a spot where the Anacostia River joined the Potomac. It was mostly farmland and marshland then. There were a few small towns like Georgetown and Alexandria. Washington knew these towns. He had personal connections to the area. He saw the potential for a grand city there. He wanted a city that would reflect the greatness of the new nation. He wanted something that would rival the great capitals of Europe. To design this grand city, Washington hired Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. L'Enfant was a French engineer and architect. He had served in the Continental Army. He had a big vision. He planned wide avenues, open spaces, and impressive buildings. He designed a city with grand boulevards radiating from important points. He wanted a city that would be easy to navigate and beautiful to look at. He imagined a place with monumental buildings and public parks, but building this city was not easy. It was hard work. The land had to be acquired from existing landowners. Many of these landowners were hesitant. They didn't want to sell their farms. They didn't trust the government. Washington had to personally negotiate with them. He had to convince them to sell their land, or parts of it, for the public good. He promised them that their remaining land would become very valuable once the capital was built. This took a lot of time and effort. It needed lots of persuasion. The project faced many challenges. There was no established city there. Everything had to be built from scratch. Roads had to be cleared. Swamps had to be drained. Materials had to be brought in. There were arguments over money. There were arguments over Lenfont's grand plans. Some people thought his plans were too ambitious, too expensive. Lenfant himself was difficult to work with. He had a grand vision, but wasn't good at management. He often clashed with the commissioners overseeing the project. Eventually, Washington had to fire him. The new city was called the Federal City at first. Then, in 1791, the commissioners officially named it Washington in honor of the president. The district around it was called the Territory of Columbia, which later became the District of Columbia. So, Washington, D.C. was born, but the choice was not popular everywhere. Northern states felt cheated. They thought they had been forced to give up the capital. They felt the Potomac was too far south. They worried it would become a swampy, unhealthy place. Many in Philadelphia, which was serving as the temporary capital for 10 years, believed the capital would never truly leave. They thought the project on the Potomac was too hard, too expensive, and would fail. They hoped the government would just stay in Philadelphia permanently. It was a big gamble. A lot of people thought Washington's dream was just that, a dream. Like, they didn't believe it would actually happen. Rebuilding the president's house, what we now call the White House, was a massive undertaking. It showed the ambitions of the new nation. The founders wanted a grand building. It needed to show power and stability. It needed to be worthy of a president of a free republic. It was not going to be a king's palace, but it still needed to be impressive. In 1792, they held a design competition for the president's house. Many architects submitted plans. James Hoban, an Irish architect, won. His design was for a large, elegant stone mansion. It was inspired by Irish country houses. It was a stately, dignified building, not overly ornate, but still grand. The scale of the project was huge for the time. America was a young country. It didn't have a lot of money. It didn't have many skilled workers. Building such a large structure in what was essentially wilderness was a monumental task. The chosen site was remote. It was hard to get materials to the site. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Lumber had to be cut and hauled. Bricks had to be made. Everything took time and effort. Money was a constant problem. Congress was always short on funds. They kept having to ask for more money. Sometimes the project would slow down because there wasn't enough cash. This made building even harder. There were also labor shortages. Free white laborers were hard to find. Many did not want to work in the harsh conditions. So, the commissioners often relied on enslaved people. These enslaved individuals, hired or owned by the government and various contractors, did much of the difficult and dangerous work. They dug foundations, quarried stone, cut timber, and built walls. They were essential to the construction of the president's house and other federal buildings. Immigrant workers, especially from Ireland and Scotland, also played a crucial role. They were often skilled stonemasons. Thomas Jefferson, even before he became president, took a keen interest in the building's design. He was an amateur architect himself. He submitted a design for the president's house under a fake name. He didn't win, but he often offered advice and suggestions. He believed in the importance of good architecture for the new nation. The construction took many years. From 1792, it slowly rose from the ground. While it was being built, the government was still in Philadelphia. This was a temporary arrangement for 10 years. Many people in Philadelphia thought the government would just stay there. They saw the difficulties in building a new capital as proof that the project would fail. They thought it was too ambitious, they thought it was too costly, they even thought the swampy land of the Potomac was unhealthy. They spread rumors that diseases would strike anyone living there. The new capital city, Washington, D.C., was a huge gamble. It was a symbol of hope and ambition, but it was also a struggle. The fear was real that the project might fail, that the government might move back to Philadelphia for good, or that some other city with existing infrastructure might eventually become the permanent capital. The early years of building the president's house and the Capitol were marked by financial woes, labor issues, and skepticism. It was far from a sure thing that the White House would ever be finished or that the government would actually move there. It was a race against time and doubt, but they pushed forward. The year 1800 arrived, and with it, the moment of truth. The government was supposed to move from Philadelphia to the new capital on the Potomac. John Adams, the second president, packed up his belongings. He left the comfort of Philadelphia for the wilderness of Washington, D.C. His wife, Abigail Adams, wrote about her journey and her first impressions. She found the city mostly unfinished. The president's house was far from complete. It was still damp inside. There was no fence, no garden. It sat on a muddy plain. She famously complained about the lack of firewood and the difficulty of getting things done. She hung her laundry in the unfinished East Room. The other federal buildings were also incomplete. The Capitol building, where Congress would meet, was still a shell. There were few paved roads, few stores, few houses. The city was a mix of construction sites and forest. People often called it a capital of scattered villages, or city of magnificent distances, but without magnificent buildings. It truly felt like a frontier town, not a seat of government. Despite all these challenges, the government did move. This act, in itself, was a huge commitment. It showed that the Compromise of 1790 was holding. It showed that the founders were serious about their new capital. They had invested so much in the project. Now they had to make it work. Then came the War of 1812. In August 1814, British troops marched into Washington. They burned the Capitol building, the Treasury, and the President's house. It was a national humiliation. The Capitol was sacked. Many people thought this was the end. They thought it was proof that Washington, D.C. was a bad choice. They suggested moving the capital back to Philadelphia or somewhere safer, but paradoxically, the burning of Washington solidified its status. The destruction sparked a sense of national pride and determination. It became a symbol of American resilience. Rebuilding the Capitol became a matter of honor. It was a way to show the world that America would not be defeated. The destroyed buildings, including the President's house, were quickly rebuilt. The President's house was painted white to cover the scorch marks, which some say led to its famous name, the White House. This act of rebuilding, right on the same spot, cemented the Capitol's location. By this point, too much had been invested. Moving the Capitol again would have been too costly, both financially and politically. The government had spent millions of dollars on land, buildings, and infrastructure. To abandon it would have been a huge waste. It would have meant admitting defeat. Also, the political will to move the capital had faded. The North-South Compromise was still holding. Moving it again would reignite old rivalries. It would open up another bitter debate. No one wanted to go through that again. The location on the Potomac, even with its early problems, had become an accepted part of the national fabric. The symbolism of a permanent capital also grew stronger over time. It represented the stability and endurance of the American Republic. It showed that the United States was a lasting nation. It was a place where the will of the people was exercised. It had a physical home. And George Washington's vision, though slow to materialize, eventually paid off. The Potomac did become a key waterway. The city, despite its initial struggles, slowly grew. It started to attract businesses and people. It began to fulfill its purpose as a central hub for the government. So, the White House and the Capitol itself stayed in Washington, D.C. because of a mix of factors. It was born out of a crucial political compromise. It was shaped by George Washington's personal vision. It survived the early struggles of construction and finance, and it was ultimately secured by the resolve to rebuild after a devastating war. Once the commitment was made and the blood and treasure were spent, it became impossible to turn back. The initial doubts faded. The young nation had found its permanent home.